Hi, this is Keith Brooks. This is what my real voice sounds like. I, as a creator, artist, and nunchuck enthusiast, enjoy giving myself challenges, like solving puzzles, writing screenplays, or paying my water bill. A recent challenge I challenged myself with that has proven to be quite challenging is a project in which I spend 100 days playing and researching 100 different musical instruments, making videos about them and posting them to social media. Here you'll find that previously described 100-day challenge in 10 long-ass segments for your consumption pleasure. Enjoy or don't. I don't care. I'm Keith Brooks.
Hi everybody, thanks for joining us. Today we're going to be talking about this motherfucker. A little out of tune, but it's still a beautiful fucking instrument. This is what is known as a piano forte. That's the full name, but you might know it as a piano. Sort of go into what a piano is. This piano model is called an upright piano, meaning it stands straight up. It's not a baby grand or anything like that. You can sort of see it has a back on it. It's a little bit more compact so it can fit in more places. This model of piano started being made in 1826 by Robert Wunram, but the piano itself dates back a little bit older than that, and we'll talk about that in a second. The piano is an instrument that is played by striking specific keys, which inside the mechanics of the piano will then trigger hammers that hit strings. Now, because of that, there are two separate thoughts about what type of instrument a piano is. Some people say it's a percussion instrument, because again, as opposed to plucking the strings, it's striking them. It is using a hammer. It's basically the same principle as a glockenspiel, at least the original version of a glockenspiel that we kind of discussed, right? A lot of people, and more people, I think nowadays, refer to it as a stringed instrument, or specifically amongst that category, a chordophone. It's a chromatic instrument, meaning I can play all the notes in the scale, any scale I want to. I got this piano from Iwa Win, who's an amazing human being. Him and his husband gave this to me, and they're absolutely fantastic, so thank you so much for the piano. The piano itself is an instrument that was created in 1698 by an Italian man by the name of Bartolomeo Cristofori. Instruments that led up to its creations, notably the cymbalum, which is like a large string instrument. It looks very interesting and very cool. The harpsichord or the clavichord and the forte piano, before we got to this type of version, the piano forte. What does piano forte mean? Well, in Italian, the word piano means soft, and the word forte means loud. This was the revolutionary idea that made the piano so fucking popular and incredible of an instrument, is that it introduced the idea of weighted keys. Do you see how gently I'm pressing? And hear how gentle the sound is. I have complete emotional manipulation through that. If I'm playing something angry, the music can then reflect that. That strike, the force with which I strike the key is exactly the force with which the hammer strikes the string. Now, before, the harpsichord and the clavichord didn't really have that capability. One of the amazing principles about piano is that it sort of invites you to understand music in a very complex way. You're not only playing the melody, you're not only playing the harmony, you're not only playing the rhythm, you're playing all of those at the same exact time. It sort of encourages that within the music itself. And it's kind of a beautiful thing. I speak of the piano probably more highly than I speak of other instruments. I don't know necessarily that it's my favorite instrument, but it is the instrument that I learned music on first. There's this new phrase that's being passed around in musicology that I kind of like, called the chord view. And what it means is this idea of what a musician's initial instrument was, and then how they understand the rest of their comprehension of music. By that I mean, if you're learning a new language, only understand that language in comprehension and relationship to your language. Okay, cool. Their verbs work like this, which is different than my understanding of a verb based in my language. Does that make sense? Sort of notion that we all do of associating new information with what's already familiar to us. Cool, I don't know who Moon Knight is in Marvel, but he's sort of like the Marvel equivalent of Batman. I know who Batman is. This gives me a basis of information that I can go from. Makes sense? Something happens when we're playing different instruments. Since piano was the first instrument I learned to play, everything else that I'm picking up or that I start to learn, until I fully understand the mechanics of it, I'm still thinking of it musically the way I think of a piano. In an abstract sense, when I'm trying to picture a musical note, it's not an amorphous thing. I'm picturing it actually on the keys. Tons of different types of pianos. Baby grands are also super popular, and those are larger, better quality pianos often. They have more room for the chord and the string structure to actually operate and resonate. Upright piano is the most popular piano because it does save a lot of space. There are also micro pianos, there are pedal pianos, and that's different than the pedals that a piano has. You also have electric keyboards, which is something that we will discuss later. Behind me, you can sort of see the back of something that's called a mirror piano. What a mirror piano is, it starts off its life as a player piano, meaning something that has the mechanics within it. If you insert a sheet of music, the machine within the piano can actually read that sheet of music and play that song back to you. Almost like a computer program, right? And these were really, really popular in the 20th century. But then the problem happened that during World War I and World War II, people still wanted pianos, but there wasn't enough material around to go make new pianos. So instead, they gutted a lot of these player pianos and converted them into pianos that you could actually play, which is what a mirror piano is. This is just being housed at my house while I take a look at it, but my buddy Lex owns a business and he's actually selling that thing, so you should hit him up. It's a good deal. If you want to hear some amazing music out of this instrument, I'm going to give you my #1 recommendation. My favorite pianist is probably somebody you're not going to expect. It's Nat King Cole. Most people recognize Nat King Cole as a jazz singer of the crooners, but he was also the first African-American to ever have his own television variety show, and the first African-American to ever have a television show that was broadcast nationally. Before all of that, Nat King Cole was a piano player for a jazz trio, the Nat King Cole Trio. He still sang a couple of things, but singing was never his intentional goal. In fact, Nat King Cole had a stutter and a lisp and was completely shy. Some of those early recordings of Nat are just fucking incredible. It's a trio that's normally consisting of a piano, guitar, and bass. Just absolutely phenomenal, some of the stuff that they do. Thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful musical day, day 21 of 100 Days of Musical Instruments. Hi everybody, today we're going to be talking about this motherfucker. This instrument is known as a melodica. A woodwind instrument, a free reed instrument that is played by keys and me blowing through a tube right here like this. It's a free reed instrument, kind of like the harmonica that we talked about earlier. In fact, this is often compared to a harmonica, and you'd be surprised to learn that in 1958, it was created by the Hohner Company in Germany, which we've talked about them before. So it does have ancestors in other free reed instruments that were played using keys and blowing on things. That sounded dirty. Harmoniophone is the oldest living one that we have, and it dates to about 1868-ish, found in France. 1958, as previously said, the Hohner Company, known for harmonicas, released what they call the melodica. Instead of keys, it was buttons. It was a soprano melodica, but it was a trademarked name. The same year, an Italian company developed something called the clavietta, which is more akin to this and became famous because a lot of jazz musicians started playing it on the television and stuff like that. Over time, the more popular brand name of melodica sort of just caught on as a catch-all for all of the instruments that were kind of like this. Sort of like how Kleenex. It refers to all tissues. Technically, Hohner is the only people that actually make melodicas because it is a trademark name. We find that as a pattern for a lot of instruments made within the past century. Again, how it works is I simply blow in this tube and press a key down. If I'm blowing and not pressing a key, nothing happens. But the minute I release one of the keys, but also notice that I can change the dynamics of how the instrument sounds. So, for example, hear that increasing softness and loudness? That's me changing the force of my breath as I put it through the instrument, thus changing the dynamics. Also, one of the key features of this instrument, something you might recognize if you've played brass instruments or woodwind instruments, is on the back there's this little hole. What this hole is a spit valve. Because I'm using my breath to play the instrument, because it is an aerophone operated by the mouth, saliva inevitably builds up into it, right? And if we have saliva affecting any of these double reeds or any of these keys, it can affect the sound. It can warp them. Instruments can be very, very durable, but also things like temperature and moisture can really affect how they sound and warp them. A lot of times, having a perfect musical instrument is all about the condition it's kept in, and we want to keep it in that same manufactured harmony, right? So, the spit valve allows us to rid the instrument of any moisture that's gathered in there to help us preserve the actual sound that the instrument makes. I just said instrument 95 times. You want to hear some great music using this instrument? I highly recommend you check out Mateo Pascoal. He's a Brazilian musician that found a way to play this and sing at the same time, which is fucking crazy, and he looks like a Fraggle from Fraggle Rock. He's my favorite. Also, another great person to check out is Jean-Baptiste, the musician from the Colbert show. He's absolutely fucking phenomenal. Just won a Grammy maybe 2 years ago, but he plays the piano and this quite frequently and quite often. He finds a great way to manipulate this with jazz and pop music, and it's absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for tuning in. You're wonderful. Day 22 of 100 Days of Musical Instruments. Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining us. Today we're going to be talking about this motherfucker and make it go choo-choo. These right here are what are known as toy train whistles. One is a 3-note toy train whistle. This one is a 4-note toy train whistle. Meant to emulate the sound of a train. It can either be played individually or all together. That one doesn't work so hot. Steam engine locomotive was first created in 1806. Revolutionized the future of this country that I'm in right now, the United States of America. As I was saying that sentence, I realized you might be watching this from a different country. And it probably revolutionized your country too. Changed the concept of expansion and labor and resulted in some harsh injustices and furthered some systemic racism in our country. But also, we got places faster? So it's no surprise that America and our pop culture and our fiction and our music were sort of obsessed with this behemoth of a monster. They're in praise of it or denouncing it. You can look at the stories of John Henry versus Johnny Cash. Those classic different interpretations of what a train can mean, right? It might surprise you that these old-fashioned toys meant to replicate the sound of a steam whistle sounding off didn't come about for over 100 years later. These weren't introduced until the 1930s, and not even in this form. Initially, train whistles were plastic, they were shaped like a train, and had one note on them. And they lasted that way until roughly the 1960s, and only then did these start to emerge. Same fucking age as my mom. In reality, in the 1930s, it was still an obsession with trains because they were still the most dominant form of transportation out there. Automobiles existed, but they still weren't in every pocket of America. In the 1960s, these were brought back as a way to revitalize people's interest in trains. Interesting thing about the train systems and whistles, that every country has its own whistle codes when it comes to locomotives. Remember when we were discussing the chow gong, and some of the elements of it were we would alert people and how many strikes would tell you how to behave in specific situations? Train whistles operate the same exact way. Depending on what is sounded tells you what's going on and how you need to respond accordingly. Those whistle alerts and whistle speak or whistle language changes from country to country. American trains sound very different than Japanese trains or British trains or any other country's trains, right? It's sort of meant to emulate some of those ideas in a very fun way. This sound is iconic to American history. This is a woodwind aerophone instrument. It's still predominantly seen as a toy, but this brings up an interesting thing that I would like to discuss. Two things. 1930s version, the plastic one that only sounded one note, one of the things that made it super popular were radio shows. Radio and in film, we have something called Foley. My job is I'm an actor. I also direct and produce, and I made a couple podcasts and stuff like that. The things about those projects is you don't always capture all of the sound on set. Main focus is the dialogue. And sometimes we don't even get the dialogue great and we have to go do something called ADR. But more importantly, when we're trying to accentuate and sweeten some of the environmental sounds, we have to add them in post, meaning post-production, meaning after production's already done. That process in film is called Foley. In old radio programs, when they would do the radio shows live, you had somebody whose job was to make the sound effects. So if a character was supposed to be walking, train was going by. That's one place where some of these instruments that are a little bit more out there can be really helpful. The second way is what these were meant to do. Teaching our children music at an early age helps them in all sorts of different dynamics and fields. Not only does music encourage us to learn math, the alphabet, but it also teaches us emotions. We have to be able to empathize. We have to be able to control our dynamics. It teaches us to calm down. It teaches us pacing, rhythm, tempo, meter. It teaches us timing. It teaches us to play together. And oftentimes with an instrument like this, it can be a gateway for learning about history. The opposite end of that coin, there's a whole swath of music that incorporates kids' instruments to their recordings. Whether it be Beck, Tom Waits, The Residents, any sort of child's toy that makes a sound can be manipulated and used. The same way when we were talking about the boomwhackers and we discussed junk music, kids' toys are a great source of new sounds that most people aren't using. And it sort of challenges your own creativity as well. I know this is a simple thing that you can't play a lot of songs with. There are some combinations, and I just find it super interesting and a great source to at least start talking about different ideas with. That being said, the suggestion I have for you today is not going to be a conventional one. It's not actually incorporating this instrument, but it's incorporating a person doing this sound themselves. There's a group of brothers called the Moron Brothers. Yep, they're some old school redneck bluegrass musicians. Not everything they say is politically correct, but they do have some interesting music and some funny stuff, and they make train noises. They make a whole sketch about making train noises. It's kind of funny. You should go check those guys out, and thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have a Rudy Tootin' day. I don't know what that means. Day 23 of 100 Days of Musical Instruments. Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining us. Today we're going to be talking about this motherfucker. Fuck yeah. This type of instrument is referred to as a pellet drum or a rattle drum. I hate that fucking distinction though. I hate rattle drum as a term. I just think it's dumb. And it insinuates that the drum rattles when in fact it does not. Pellet drum and rattle drums are just a subsection of the percussion distinction amongst musical instruments. There are tons of different types of pellet and rattle drums. This one specifically has two names, Bolangu or the Taogu. Gu is just Mandarin for drum. This one's got like a really cool dragon on it, and it says Kung Fu on the side of it right there, and it's pretty cool. Now, the reason it has two names is kind of interesting. The type of instrument can be found all over the world, though the Bolangu and the Taogu are Chinese. There's also a Japanese version called the Denden Daiko that's very similar to this, and there's a lot of different Korean versions and African versions as well. We'll talk about the African version tomorrow. There's also a Latin American version and a Caribbean version, and we'll talk about the Caribbean version today. The way it's played is relatively simple. You take the drum in your hand, and it's just allowing it to go back and forth. This was invented, the Chinese version, in roughly 450 BC. So this is an old-ass fucking instrument. Initially, it was called the Taogu. The Taogu was used in religious ceremonies. The idea was that the spinning of it was a solemn sort of thing that monks could pray along with while keeping a relatively consistent beat, right? Over time, though, Chinese culture said, fuck that, it's a toy now. And so you probably most recognize it from if you've ever been to a lantern festival. You'll see kids or people just playing with these, right? Walking around making those noises. It's in this transition from being a religious instrument into a child's plaything that we get the name change, going from Taogu to Bolongu. But there's some more interesting things to be involved there. The Japanese variant, the Dindindaiko, and all of the Korean variants are still used to this day amongst religious ceremonies. The Japanese one looks exactly like this one. The Korean ones, the variations are fucking crazy because they're a lot taller, and they'll have like multiples of these all facing different directions, and it's just fucking hardcore. One of the interesting things about Chinese musical instruments, it's believed that the Chinese people and the Chinese culture have the first categorizing system for musical instruments. One of the things I love about ancient Chinese culture and ancient Chinese philosophy, it's all about grouping shit together and like lists. If you're a nerd, like research Chinese monsters, because they're all like 4 auspicious beasts, 5 divine animals, 6 evil colors, like it's all shit like that. It's absolutely amazing. And the same thing was true about musical instruments. All of the ancient Chinese musical instruments, and to an extent today's musical instruments, are classified not by whether they belong in percussion, whether they belong in strings, but instead by the materials that they are made of. This is a long-standing way to separate them. It's referred to as the Ba Yin. So Ba meaning 8, also a very lucky number within Chinese culture, and Yin meaning sound. And they are, let's see if I can do this off the top of my head. So it is silk, wood, gourd, metal, clay, bamboo, stone, and skin. This falls into the skin category because of the hide used to make the drum, as do the vast majority of Chinese drums. There is an African variation of this instrument that, again, we will talk about tomorrow. But you might also have seen an instrument like this in the Caribbean. You might be thinking, oh, that makes total sense because of the African diaspora that exists in the Caribbean. But that's where you're fucking wrong. It actually comes from the Chinese diaspora that made their way into the Caribbean. Let's not forget that before America assumed the moniker of the melting pot, that actually belonged to the Caribbean itself, because so many cultures intermingled there. Not always voluntarily, mind you. There's a lot of fucking bad stuff we still should talk about, but still. Rich Chinese population that settled within the Caribbean, mostly in Jamaica, are responsible for this instrument making its way all the way to the fucking islands. Distinct factors of it, and it's something we'll discuss a little bit more tomorrow as well, is the thickness of the drum. Look how thick it is, mama. Yeah, you like that. But it's a rich sound that still to a lot of people represents a religious aspect, but it also can show us how the way we view things changes over time, even so much as producing a name change. Want to hear some more amazing stuff regarding this instrument and the Ba Yin? I highly recommend this YouTube channel called Off the Great Wall. Think about the idea of off the wall. I think about the Great Wall of China. It's a YouTube channel just dedicated to like exploring Chinese mythology and Chinese culture. Just fucking love it. I think it's a great channel and I highly recommend it. And they have a couple of episodes where they talk about Chinese musical instruments and mention the Ba Yin and how they were broken down and all of that stuff. Thank you so much for joining day 24 of 100 days of musical instruments. Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining us. Today we're going to be talking about this motherfucker. What's known as a Ratatak, or a spinner drum, or a monkey drum, or a spirit drum, and we'll talk about why some of those names aren't that great. This specifically, if we're going to refer to it as a Ratatak, is a double-headed Ratatak, right? And you might think it looks very similar to the instrument that we discussed last time, and that's true, because it is still a pellet drum or a rattle drum. You see that it has a drum head with 2 different wooden pellets attached to it on a rod that I can spin. But some of the differences today are the following. We see that the drum head itself is a lot thinner and more compressed. And also, the rod with which connects them that I'm spinning them is not perfectly round. And that's because the design of this instrument asks for it to be played a different way. As with the bolangu, I spun it in the entire way around. I'm not doing that with this instrument. I'm just going back and forth like I'm trying to start a fire, right? Now, it's believed that this instrument, the Ratatak, is developed in Africa, specifically by the Mandinga people, right? Mandinga is a ethnograph of Western Africa. The culture is called Manda. The people of the culture are called Mandinka, and it's from a mishearing of the phrase Mandinka that we get the word Mandingo. Mandingo is a very complicated word, whether it be used as a racist term, a fetishization term, or a term that now people are trying to apply to actually mean a person relating to the Mandinka tribe. Also a variation very similar to this that comes from Peru called the Damasis, right? And a lot of Native American tribes use an instrument very similar to this, often nowadays referred to as a spirit drum. What were these instruments used for? We don't know. Why were they invented? We have no idea. What are the Native American drums like this actually called? Not a fucking clue. A lot of the instruments that we've covered have European origins, and we very much understand their origins. Some of them have been Latin American, and we have an okay grasp of what their origins are. And yesterday we covered an Asian instrument, and we have a really great understanding of where that instrument comes from. But sometimes when it comes to indigenous instruments, those histories are lost, and you can probably guess why. Dinka people, an ethnograph that still exists to this day, occupied the vast majority of Africa that was colonized by the French. Watching this, and you're from America, you probably have a grasp of what happened to the indigenous tribes of this country. Colonization and imperialization go hand in hand with racism. It's often the thing that's used to excuse the terrible behavior that follows. And what happens to those colonized communities and societies, not only that the future of their society and where they could have developed that is sort of stunted, but it also erased part of their history. By that I mean literally. We know about all of the Chinese history of instruments because it was written down. Same thing with the European ones. And some people would argue that the African history of these instruments weren't written down. But the fact is they were. And colonizers went in and literally burned libraries to prevent any of that information from being passed down. Because he who controls the knowledge controls the power. If you erase a society's history of thriving, you erase the knowledge that they can thrive. Colonization of the world was never a peaceful thing. It was fought for in wars and wars and wars. And every time you kill a generation, you don't just kill a group of people, but you kill all of the information that they have gathered, the way they understand the world. So the following generation starts at a disadvantage. Now you do that for hundreds of years, and what information have you wiped out? You don't have to look much further than the Americas to see the systemic idea of wiping out native languages as an attempt to wipe out the native identity. And because of that, oftentimes elders, when confronted with an instrument like this, told that it's a Native American instrument, their response is, maybe, I don't know. We don't know anymore. History that remains drastically different than the old ways. Instead of how a culture originated, the culture had to go into survival mode, which is drastically different than what would have happened if it was left to thrive. This is true all over the world, not just about the colonialism of the Western world, but also the Eastern world. Every hemisphere, whether that imperialization and attack be because of racism, colorism, anti-Semitism, religious persecution, regardless of what it is, not only are the results oppression of people, but the loss of knowledge. Maybe we don't care specifically where this comes from. Hopefully, as a part of this series, I'm learning, and hopefully you're learning as well, that each of these instruments has a place within their societies and cultures and an interesting story behind it. Manda is also a group of languages, obviously spoken by the Mandinka people, and there's about 75 languages. I looked everywhere that I could to try to see if the Ratatak translates to anything specifically. Unfortunately, it doesn't. There is a lot of theory that it is an onomatopoeia, that it's actually the sound that's being created. Ratatak, ratatak, like like that sort of idea. It's also interesting because there are other instruments that are referred to often as Ratatak, mostly ratchets and ratchet spinners and shakers and stuff like that, but they always have a name that comes after them as well. This is the only one referred to specifically as the Ratatak, but there's not a lot of academic information regarding some of this stuff. And again, that's because a lot of the history has been lost. Sometimes you'll see it referred to as a monkey drum. Now, again, there's some academic debate whether or not that term is meant as a racist term or not. There actually is something called a monkey drum that's a Brazilian drum. That's a scrape drum. That's absolutely fucking crazy. It just makes a weird whiny noise. I'm going to see if I can get my hands on one for one of these videos, but I'm going to steer away from the monkey drum idea. In addition to that, there's also a lot of people that will refer to these as spirit drums, but the idea of a spirit drum is a very specific thing to each specific culture, right? So the Dene people, often referred to as the Navajo, and the Chalagi people, the Cherokee, have their own different distinct versions of what a spirit drum is, and it's more about its ceremonial use, and neither one look like this. Oftentimes people will, as selling things, they'll just put on something spirit drum as a way to make it seem like it's ancient and connected to the world, when really they're just capitalizing on somebody else's culture. It's appropriation. And so sorting through some of that information can be kind of difficult to find what's real and what's just a marketing ploy. By today, my suggestion is going to be a little bit different. If you want to hear more about instruments like this, or the idea of preserving what music has been and can be, check out the Global Music Project. I think the website's globalmusicproject.org, a charitable organization that helps people in a multitude of ways by donating free instruments to people in need, but also seeking to preserve musical history and musical sounds, giving free lectures, free music education, offering recording time to indigenous people so that way we don't lose all of those beautiful sounds that the world has originated. Look, I know that music isn't a vaccine, it isn't an airplane, it isn't a war, but it is still a part of our lives that enriches it. It makes it better. I'm some liberal, bleeding heart artist that's trying to tell you why art is important. Every day we consume it. Art might not nourish our stomachs, but it does nourish our soul, and it gives our brain an outlet to comprehend and deal with all of the shit that life gives us. That part of learning is you take in the knowledge, and then you synthesize it and put it back out into the world. And music is the means by which we synthesize all of our feelings, all of our angst, all of our emotions, all of our history, and we bring it back out to a beat, into rhythm, into melody, into harmony, into expression. Thank you so much for joining day 25 of 100 days of musical instruments. Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining us. Today we're going to be talking about this motherfucker. This instrument is called the Agogo. Specifically, this is the Agogo bell, because we'll talk about the original Agogo momentarily. This instrument is African in its origin, originating from the Yoruba and the Edo people. It's like in the Nigeria area is the Edo people. The Agogo is a percussive instrument, an idiophone. The Agogo bell is two bells struck with a stick. I'm using a drumstick right now. Often when I'm playing these, I kind of like to use a padded mallet because that allows me a little bit of a softer noise, but then I also can get with the same little stick. So, it gives you variety. So you can see that it's two bells. The smaller bell, which is more high pitched, goes on top. The lower bell, you use this metal container thing as the handle, allowing you to then play it. You get this sort of idea. But you can also do like sustain hits. You can also do rattles. You can also do side clips. If I hold it here. Also, you can do squeezing. that sort of idea. The sound of the bell is a very significant sound to the Yoruba people. Not only is it involved with religious ceremonies, but it was actually a part of the social experience as well. Oftentimes, a town crier would belong in the Yoruba village, and they would strike a bell alerting everyone to gather the fuck around and listen to what they had to say. It was also a part of anything that the chieftain's high occultist would have to say. They would accompany it by the sound of the Agogo, right? All prayers had to be accompanied by this. There's actually a really popular Yoruba epic film called Soworo Ide and Agogo Iwo that's considered one of the best Yoruba films ever made, and it's about one of the high priests using, like, this thing, right? This instrument originated before it was bells, before it was made out of metal. It's by something that looks more akin to this. Now, the traditional original Agogo is a stick with 2 coconut shells mounted onto it. This is sort of a variation with 3, but it sort of gives us that same idea. Right? So it's still that high-pitched sort of announcing percussion that's great for rhythmic little hits, right? You can see how it fits in really well with samba, which is a perfect segue into what happens to it in the next part of its evolution. There's a good chance that you don't know this from the traditional Yoruba music, but you might know it from Brazilian music. Now remember, Brazil had a huge influx of slave population. The slave trade was massive there. So the Afrocentric population was huge and is indelible into that culture. So this comes to Brazil and becomes a part of the samba bateria, meaning the samba band. This is the traditional, one of the traditional instruments that comprises the samba music. But in addition to that, it also becomes a huge aspect of some Afro-Brazilian religions, notably Candomblé. Candomblé is a religion that is a monotheistic thing that also has different deities called orishas. It's a very popular religion amongst the Afro diaspora within Brazil, and also within something called macumba. Macumba is sort of like a catch-all term that means technically the worship of low spirits, but it's sort of like the way Americans use the term Wiccan. They typically aren't referring to the actual faith of Wicca, but more they mean it as a synonym for pagan, right? And anything that has witchy sort of properties. Macumba is kind of used the same way. This is an important part of the religious ceremonies, the same way it was an important part of the religious ceremonies within the Yoruba people. Shifting continents, it stayed with its purpose. Again, it's focusing on that high end of the spectrum that a lot of times Western music doesn't have within their percussion. But Latin, South American, and African music love to sort of accentuate what they're doing rhythmically with that high-pitched sound. And this fits that perfectly. When we're talking about recording and mixing music, we're looking for any sort of sound that can cut through the noise of everything else, and the bell is a perfect way to do that. If you want to hear more by it, I have a specific song I want you to check out. It's a song you've probably heard before. Love Roller Coaster by the Ohio Players. Roller coaster, oh love. That song. I want you to go listen to it and see if your ear can pick out playing in the background, because it's pretty fucking prominent. And you might see that after you hear it in that song, you'll hear it in all kinds of songs. There's a lot of heavy metal bands from the early 2000s that used this motherfucker a lot. Soulfly used it like crazy. Thank you so much for tuning in today. You're awesome. I hope you have a wonderful day, day 26 of 100 days of musical instruments. Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining us. Today we're going to be talking about this motherfucker. This instrument here is known as a Didgeridoo, or a Yidaki, or a Mandapal, or a Mako, and there's tons of other names for it, but we'll get all into that. This instrument originates in Australia, used by Aboriginal tribes. I believe it dates back a little bit over 1,000 years ago. The earliest recorded examples of this instrument can be found in paintings, and specifically those date back to about 1,000 years. Specifically, those paintings are found in Arnhem Land, which is a northern territory of Australia. It's a woodwind instrument that produces a drone type of sound. Now, how do you play it? So these are normally just cut down by the musician from trees. Normally, they try to find a piece of wood that has been affected by white ants. In the West, we call them termites. Chop it down, you spruce it up, and we're going to use the same embouchure that we used for the brass instruments, right? That idea of the noise, right? But the slight difference here is we're going to tighten the outer sides of our lips, almost like we're doing like a Joker smile, and then sort of that sound. So then we get... Now I'm sort of pushing forward. I can also do stuff like that. That happens just by trying to pronounce the letter T in the middle of that embouchure. It's kind of interesting, right? The name Didgeridoo that everybody sort of associates with it isn't actually the actual name of this instrument. That's the name that outsiders gave to the instrument, which is sort of like a running theme when it comes to indigenous things. Oftentimes when people outside of Australia think about the Aboriginal culture, they sort of make it a monolith and assume that it's just one united culture. But in truth, the phrase and term Aboriginal is a catch-all, the same way First Nation is here in the United States. Aboriginal people are composed of tons of different communities and cultures that all have specific, unique beliefs unto them. Sure, a lot of them are united by several things. Dreaming law, for example, seems to be a governing principle most of the Aboriginal cultures sort of abide in. And most tend to have an instrument like this, or a traveler's version, which is all like fucking wound up and super cool. But each of those unique, beautiful cultures has their own name for this. One group calls it the Yidaki. As of recently, they've referred to it as the Mandapal. There's also the Mako. Those are the biggest, most popular ones. There are like 46, 47 other different groups of people that have an instrument like this that call it by a different name. Yidaki seems to be the most prevalent one, especially in a current climate where we're trying to step away from colonialized names. By that, I mean the names that people enforced on others. A huge proponent of whatever you want to be referred to as. I will respect that. I will not try to thrust upon you my own interpretation of who you are. Lots of different stuff that applies to, not just the names of musical instruments. There are multiple different cultures within the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, much less Oceania in general. For a vast majority of them, this instrument is a sacred one. Oftentimes, it's played while these clapsticks called the bilma are used to keep time, and this is used as the primary melodic instrument. Or there's a genre of Aboriginal music called wanga, and wanga has singing accompanied by this and the bilma. It's also used in pop music, in rock and roll music, and all of that stuff. But that's where we get to a little bit of controversy. A lot of more traditional Aboriginal communities believe that it's sacrilegious for a female to play the didgeridoo. A lot of ethnomusicologists and anthropologists have pointed out that there's nothing against it in the dreaming law. It's sort of seen as a taboo thing still. Yet there are Aboriginal communities that have women playing the didgeridoo all the time. And in some sects of Aboriginal communities, it's considered a sin should any outsider, non-Aborigine, play this instrument. It has become a staple of the soundscape that we associate with Australia. A lot of people feel that it is exploitation, the way it's used often. It's a tragic situation, and I don't think I specifically am a person that can offer much insight into what that situation is. Recommendation today, if you want to hear some great music with this instrument, I recommend a man by the name of David Blanasi, Blanasi, who himself was an Aboriginal musician. He traveled the world and played with tons of rock groups and different people, and he referred to anybody that played this instrument as his brother by blood. And there's this great quote I love of his, where he says that as long as I play this, I keep the spirit of my people alive. And hopefully when I die, they'll still hear it and they'll still think of us. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful day. Day 27 of 100 days of musical instruments. Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining. Today we're going to be talking about this motherfucker. This is what's known as a flexatone or a flex metal. It is an idiophone, indirectly struck idiophone, meaning I'm not the one striking it, but I am putting mechanics in motion that will lead to it being struck. Yeah, that's how that's phrased. So this instrument was first patented in England in 1922. It came to the United States. It was patented in America in 1924. I don't actually have the information for who created it. It was originally devised as an instrument for jazz music. Let me tell you a little bit about how to play it. So you can see that it consists of a weird-ass coat hanger handle, a bar of metal, and then two little hitter things, two little mallets, right? Here's how you play it. You hold it like this, holding the handle with 4 fingers, putting your thumb on the flexametal, right? Then I shake it. And you hear that first warping sound? I can also play it even further and accentuate and change the notes by pushing in the metal. I can also swing it like that, give a slight sound by doing this. There's the option to actually take these off, and you can hit it with a stick. And then some people actually use an orchestral bow and bow against either one of these sides, creating this strange warping sound. Initially used for jazz music, but then it was seen as too limited of a novelty. You can change the pitch, but it's a little hard to specify on a singular note, right? It changes instrument by instrument, right? Individual piece by individual piece are crafted a little bit differently, so finding those specific notes becomes a difficult thing to do. But it became really popular, again, within something we talked about earlier, Foley. There's a good chance if you've watched a cartoon from the 1930s to the 1960s, you heard this, of somebody getting hit in the head, whatever, that sort of idea, this glissando sound. Glissando, I always think about it as piano, but again, that's my chord view, is when you take your fingers and run them up or down the keys, and you're getting all of the keys together, right there, like that. Great Balls of Fire does it a couple of times, and that was always really fun for me to play. That sort of accentuating sweeping of all the musical notes is called the glissando, and that's basically what this does, right? Started off as a jazz instrument, then became sort of a novelty instrument, then went into Foley. It eventually found its way into classical music. And a lot of postmodern classical music will incorporate this instrument because of the strange soundscape that it provides. In composition, we often use the word soundscape to describe a vibe, a feeling, an atmosphere. A sound bed tends to be an instrument or a group of instruments that provide a certain cohesion to the song. I think about Coldplay a lot whenever I think about sound beds, because that's kind of how I learned to do it. Coldplay often will incorporate organs or piano, and it's not the main focus of the instrument, but it's sort of in the background as the connective tissue, whereas a soundscape is an accent, just providing a little bit more of an environment for us. Now, soundscape in terms of genre of music is a completely different thing. We're talking about within composing music versus genre of music. The term could be used by different people to mean very different things. As an actor, I use the word beat, but as a musician, I also use the word beat, and they're drastically different ideas. Instrument is not often used as the main melodic idea behind the song, but instead operates as sort of a accent to whatever's occurring. What I like about it is it sort of tests your idea of resistance. You know, whenever you're doing weight training, which you could tell I do so much, they think it's all about the lifting of the weight. But one of the key elements is the resistance as you pull, as you bring it back down. But you're allowing it to go at your own speed. That same idea applies to specific elements of music as well. So in this, I can shake it. But if I want to gradually make that glissando happen, it's all about the delicacy and the resistance I'm using, because it's easy to just do that, right? But instead, I want that gradual. If you want to hear some cool music using this, I highly recommend Hungarian composer György Ligeti, a modern classical composer of the postmodern school that is considered one of the most important avant-garde composers of all time. Music is often bombastic, and it's all about soundscapes, making you feel like you're in a different world. He utilizes this instrument quite often and in interesting ways, whether it be in the traditional way that I'm playing it now or bowed. Stuff is really interesting, not really about the melody of the music, but finding harmony and dissonance and finding experimental ways to make you feel things. It's absolutely incredible. I highly recommend it, especially if you're into avant-garde music. Thank you so much for checking this out. I've been checking you out, with your awesome intelligence and witty sense of humor. Day 28 of 100 Days of Musical Instruments. Bye, everybody. Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining. Today we're going to be talking about this motherfucker. This instrument right here is called a Dizi. Spelled D-I-Z-I. It's a Chinese simple flute that is a transverse flute. Remember we talked about these earlier when we talked about a fife. It just goes this way. It's a simple flute because it's comprised of simple materials. Simple flutes are one of the most common sorts of instruments out there. Almost any indigenous flute can be qualified as a simple flute. It's one of the oldest types of instruments there are. We have evidence to believe that simple bone flutes existed 42,000 years ago, which is kind of fucking crazy. This instrument here, the Dizi, about 7,000 years old. It originates from China and has evolved with several different versions of it. Most popular is the Shijie. The Shijie is the sort of like modern equivalent that takes a lot of the structure of the Dizi, but also gives it a chromatic scale. This does not have a chromatic scale, only a diatonic scale. Originally, these were made out of bamboo with one interesting addition that is super cool. You might notice that it looks like my Dizi has cut itself because it has a band-aid on it. But that's not an accident. That's what's supposed to be happening here. A little section is called the mukong, is the name of the hole, but we put a membrane over the top of it. Now, back in the old days, they would use thin sheets of bamboo, and they would either attach it with some like honey or garlic or something like that to give it that sort of raspy buzz sound that the Dizi has. There are variations that have a lower register or a higher register, and it's considered a crucial instrument of Chinese art and culture, notably used for kunchu, which is the form of Chinese opera. In the Western world, we would classify this as a woodwind and an aerophone. In Chinese classification, the bayin, like we discussed before, this would be classified as a bamboo instrument. Legend says that the ancestor of this instrument, the first simple flute to be created in China, was created by a man named Ling Lun. Ling Lun is the person who is said to have invented the 5 musical notes of Chinese music, which would be the equivalent of our 1, 2, 3, 5, 6. So if you're thinking about that in terms of piano, C, D, E, G, A. In turn, the bayin, the 8 different branches and types of musical instruments within Chinese culture. Oftentimes, when you see an illustration of Ling Lun, you are seeing Ling Lun playing the Dizi. Important to note that there are several different bamboo flutes within Chinese culture, but this is the most prominent one that you will see Ling Lun depicted as playing. Lun is also a mythical figure that appears in, like, I think the game Civilization, I think Smite. Bill and Ted Face the Music, though they changed the gender, which is super awesome and super cool, and that actress is phenomenal, so there you go. It said that Ling Lun's ambition was to recreate the sounds of nature and birds within the human soul and human heart, and he did that by creating instruments. If you want to hear some great music with this instrument, I highly recommend this guy named Lu Chunling. Lu Chunling was born in China in the 1920s and was a trishaw driver, like sort of like a rickshaw sort of thing. And he was that for like 35 years, where on the side, he learned to play the Dizi because he thought it was a beautiful instrument. Finally, somebody heard him playing the Dizi and wept at the sound of how beautiful it was. And they started getting him bookings, not even knowing the guy, just begging him to come play in public. And it said that everywhere he would play, people would weep. Lived until like 2018, and you can go hear some of his amazing recordings and even see him in concert. He tried to keep alive the traditional Chinese music that was around when he was a kid, and this rags to riches story is absolutely beautiful. By the time he died, he was considered the master of this instrument. And this instrument is fucking 7,000 years old. That lets you know something. This guy was great. Oh, who else is great? You. Thank you so much for tuning in. Day 29 of 100 Days of Musical Instruments. Hi everybody. everybody. Thank you so much for joining. Today we're going to be talking about this motherfucker. This is what's referred to as a Whirly Tube, or a Karugaphone, or a Bluegill resonator, or as a Freaka. That name I don't really understand. That's like a 1960s people thing. Whatever. The origins of this instrument aren't quite clear. Nobody really knows where it came from, and if it originated as a sideways. Nobody's really aware if it originated as a musical instrument or as a toy. It reached a boom in popularity in the 1960s and 1970s. It even had like the New Yorker doing a special about this hit instrument that everybody cool was playing called the Freaka. How does it work? Well, it's actually kind of a fucking complicated but also simultaneously easy thing that's happening. I'm gonna spin it and it's gonna make different noises, but just by doing that same principle, we're activating a lot of different knowledge that we've used before about music and how it works. From a scientific level, we are creating two different levels of air pressure. One here that stays and maintains, and the second one up here as it spins. But as it spins slow, we get a note. As we speed up, we get another note. As we speed up even more, we get another note. Right? The same way that we were working with like the fife, the penny whistle, the faster we blow into it, the higher the pitch. In addition to that, this instrument has no valves. It has no buttons. It has no way for me to change notes, except for exploiting its natural harmonies, the natural sounds it can make, much like the bugle. So, after all of our lessons so far, do you know what type of instrument this is? I'm gonna give you a couple seconds to guess. If you said aerophone, you're absolutely right. You said string instrument, what the fuck are you doing? What the fuck are you doing? Aerophone, because we're using air to play it, but some people get really upset when you simply classify it as an aerophone. Most often, it's described as a percussive aerophone. We're not hitting it, we're twirling it. There is some sort of snobbery at times within musical classifications. So a lot of people will say that it's not only a percussive aerophone, it's also a sound effect aerophone. But they won't say the same thing about a bugle, which I think is weird. There's a variation of this instrument called Karuga horn. Involves water and all sorts of crazy stuff. The term Karuga just means alternating ridges. So notice that these ridges go up and down, almost ribbed for our musical pleasure. That's what allows it to make that sound. It's because those ridges also exist on the inside of the instrument. Now they're just the inverse of what you see on the outside. Operates as the bell. Again, this is where our air pressure stays consistent. And the top is just the end of a tube. If I wanted to change the pitch of this, I would shorten the tube, or I would elongate the tube. Either way changes exactly what the sound being produced is. I'm always terrified of when I hit myself in the face. I'm really good with nunchucks, and I don't hit myself in the fucking face with those. I'm not, let me see if I flinch when I'm doing the chucks thing. Long, and this has nothing to do with that stuff, but I don't know if I can, yeah. So, it's kind of unruly and it's making noise. I don't know. It's weird. Thing I really like about the Whirly Tube, I had one when I was like 9, but in addition to that, most of the conversation about the Whirly Tube revolves around the physics that make it work. Tons and tons of papers written about this guy. Absolutely incredible. But it also reminds us that the sonic occurrences that we call music are a scientific phenomenon. That there is a scientific explanation for why we can change pitches, why sounds can evolve, and even to an extent why certain sounds affect us. I know it is a probably unconventional to your way of thought of having an instrument that you just swirl like you're Wonder Woman. But it's actually not the only one we'll be discussing. We'll be discussing something that's very similar called the bull roarer later. If you want to hear some great music with this, I recommend Matt Miller. Matt Miller is a musician and composer on YouTube. Go check him out. He doesn't post often, but he has one song in particular called Music for the Whirly Tube, where he has an orchestra of Whirly Tubes playing this beautiful song that he composed specifically for them. Not only does he incorporate the typical whirling, but also the percussive noise, which I think is a cool way to use this instrument. Thank you so much for joining day 30 of 100 days of musical instruments.